I don't know if you've noticed this, but Super Mario Odyssey is gaining a lot of hype. And it's not just immense hype in terms of its size, but it's very pure, very positive hype. What I've found so often now in the world of gaming is that hype always has some kind of controversy attached to it. The game doesn't look as good as when it was first shown. There's some dodgy business practice. It's just DLC from a predecessor. No, with Mario Odyssey, it's a very pure version of hype. People are just excited, they're happy, and they're looking forward to this game. And that really does go for Switch owners like myself, but it also goes for non-Switch owners who are thinking of getting a Nintendo Switch because of this game. And so I decided to make it my mission today to try and convince you why you should get a Nintendo Switch for Super Mario Odyssey. Now, obviously, I can't tell you that Super Mario Odyssey is a great game. It's not out yet. I've not played it. It looks good, but you know, we can't go purely on the basis of trailers that we've seen or demos we've played. So instead, I'm going to be focusing on the Switch, and in some respects, this will be a several months after the fact review of the Nintendo Switch. And I thought what it might be worth doing before getting into the outright positives is actually addressing the elephants in the room regarding the Switch. What might put someone off buying one? And so the first point I'm going to bring up is potentially going to be a little upsetting to hear from Nintendo fans, but it is for the greater good, so please stay with me on this one. Nintendo first-party titles do look childish, and from the outside, someone who hasn't played Nintendo games in a long time, this can be off-putting. People who are accustomed to the likes of Call of Duty and Dark Souls and Battlefield, people who are used to these very gritty-looking visuals, can be put off by the likes of Mario. You know, it's a very cartoony looking franchise with bright colours and over-the-top features. However, this must not be misconstrued for a childish experience or a basic experience or a casual experience even. Even though the visuals are, I think it's fair to say, appealing to a younger audience, that is not to say that it is the sole audience. In fact, it's quite the contrary. Nintendo games are surprisingly deep and surprisingly complex. So Breath of the Wild is the perfect example we can use here. It's a game that does look a bit cartoony, it's certainly not trying to be realistic, and yes, it's a game about saving a princess at its fundamental core, but it's not an easy game, and it's certainly not some Fisher-Price, easy, accessible game for kids or casuals. It is an in-depth game, and if you want to 100% it, you have to go hardcore on this game. In fact, I would describe Breath of the Wild as a very cerebral experience, because whether it's the combat or the shrines, it's something that requires brain power to work out. You have to consider what you're doing and use your mind and think outside of the box. This is a game that might initially appeal to someone quite young because it looks very nice and appealing, but in terms of someone like me, an older gamer, I'm 21, it will hook you with its depth and its complexity, and you have to understand that this is not just Breath of the Wild. There are many Nintendo games that share this, but this masks something that has a very refined gameplay element. I might not have some footage of it, but I'll talk about it anyway. There's the Mario and Rabbids Kingdom Battle. It's essentially an XCOM clone. This is where I made the mistake of thinking it would be a very basic experience, because, I mean, Rabbids from the Ubisoft games and Mario, this is going to be some cheap party game, surely. No, it's a very challenging, very in-depth and nuanced game that I have to say I'm not sure how some young kids are even going to complete. It's incredibly tactical and very fun to play. And then there's Mario Kart 8, which is an interesting one, because if you play Mario Kart 8 at 50cc, easiest difficulty, yeah, you know what, it's incredibly easy to play. In fact, you can even turn on some settings that make it so that the kart more or less drives itself. But then on the opposing side to that, you can go online. Online Mario Kart is not accessible. You have to be good to rank high in Mario Kart Online. It's very unforgiving. Yes, it can help people out by giving you a bullet bill if you're at the back of the pack, but you have to be pretty decent at the game to come in the second half of the ratings. I have spent a lot of time on Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and I have a new appreciation for it. When I think back to my younger days playing Double Dash on the GameCube, I still sort of consider Mario Kart as this fairly easygoing game, but now that I've played it online, I have a very different outlook on Mario Kart. It can be very competitive and very tricky, especially if you're going up against some skilled players. What's another example I could use? Maybe not ARMS so much. I think ARMS is fairly basic. What about Splatoon 2? Splatoon 2 is not a super complex game. It does use a lot of tropes as a typical shooter, although it does adopt a very different look. But then again, yeah, in some ways, is it that much more in depth than your typical Call of Duty game? Not really. You have loadouts, you have perks, you have dynamic movement, you're shooting at its core. Is Splatoon 2 any more basic, really, than a Call of Duty game? Not especially. You could say that the movement is actually more advanced, adding an extra layer of depth. So although the cartoony visuals may spark the idea that you're playing a game that isn't particularly in depth, when it comes to the reality of the situation, is actually pretty involved. You have to consider not only your aim, how good you are at shooting, but also your ability to move around the map and the map coverage with the ink. You know, there's an extra layer of depth to it. And it's not just the in-depth aspect of their games, it's also the refinement. And we have to make the distinction here between a refined game and a good game. Or not necessarily that they are mutually exclusive, by the way, they are just different things. So let me give you an example. Any Bethesda game at launch, like Skyrim, for example. Skyrim's a fantastic game, beloved by many, but you'd be hard to say that at its release, at least, it was a refined game. It had many bugs, frame rate was all over the place, you know, it was glitchy. You can't get away from that, but it was a light game. But it was not refined. You would not describe it as a refined experience, you'd describe it as an expansive, enjoyable experience. Nintendo games are the opposite of this in some respect. They are totally 100% refined, even when they're more mediocre games like ARMS is in some respects. They are refined to a T. And the crazy thing is that despite the Nintendo Switch being the least powerful of your consoles available at the moment, because it's essentially mobile hardware, it does hit 60 FPS quite a lot, because Nintendo are building their games around the limitations of the console. They're not creating the game first and then scaling back. They are actually, if you look at their development process for something like Mario Odyssey, they underestimate their hardware and then scale up. If you look at Mario Odyssey, the game was initially shown as running at 720p. However, more recent gameplay has shown 900p, because they really want to target 60 frames per second. And I don't own loads of Switch games, but the ones I do, there's a surprising number of 60 FPS experiences. Ones I can name off the top of my head would be Pokken Tournament, Mario Kart 8, Sonic Mania, although admittedly that's not a hard thing to get to 60 FPS, and Splatoon 2. You know, it can get to 60 FPS despite running on quite low spec hardware when you compare it to the other consoles. So Nintendo make experiences that are tailor-made to their device, which is very encouraging, and you don't always see that with the other platforms. Sometimes they can overstretch their system. So I think they've got a very refined way of approaching development over at Nintendo, and they even, I think, encourage their third-party developers to do the same. In fact, mentioning third party, let's use that as the springboard to the next topic. So, it's no secret that Nintendo, I think it's fair to say, since the Wii, have really struggled with third party, because they have been delivering consistently the least powerful device. You know, you compare the Wii to the 360 and the PS3, and it was the only standard definition console amongst HD. The Wii U against the PS4 and the Xbox One, again, not so powerful. And now the Switch against, I guess you could say, the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X, it pales in comparison. So naturally, third parties are going to find it hard to develop for those consoles, but then scale back to the Switch. But it seems like, at least from these early days, that they are making some changes there, because you may not be aware of this, but Doom from 2016 is actually coming to the Switch, and so is Wolfenstein. So this is running on id which is a very refined engine. And admittedly, it's running at a lesser performance, so if you were to play the game on PS4 and Xbox One, we'll take the base models here, it runs at a constant 60 FPS with a dynamic resolution. Now on the Switch, yes, it runs at 30 FPS, and I'm actually not sure what the resolution is, feel free to let me know, but it looks good still. I mean, you have to consider that this is mobile hardware and really focus in on that. What I say to some people about the Switch is that its performance is purely a matter of perspective. It's either the least powerful of the home consoles or it's the most powerful portable you've ever seen. Although, again, this is another interesting thing to talk about. The Switch actually isn't the most powerful mobile device you can get. iOS devices and Android devices outpace it. However, again, going back to Nintendo's refined development cycle, they make so much better use out of what they've got than the typical iOS or Android developer. They really know the hardware itself, and so they get better out of it as a result. But then, again, we're segueing a bit here. We'll go back to the third-party aspect of it. Again, I think the Switch does need this to be a success, and it's something that you should consider in terms of a purchase. As good as the first-party titles are, in order to really knock it out of the park, Nintendo have to encourage these third-party developers to scale back their games in an intelligent way to work on the Switch. And when I say in an intelligent way, they have to do a few things, I think. And one of those things is locking the frame rates. Sometimes when you see a bad port, essentially a developer will throw the game untampered with at the lesser device, and the device will struggle and give you a fluctuating frame rate, and there is nothing worse than a fluctuating frame rate. What an intelligent developer will do is scale back the visuals in a way that won't be too obvious, and they will lock the frame rate to the lowest common factor. So even if it's going unlocked between 40 and 50, they'll bring it back to 30 because 30 consistently looks better than a jumping about frame rate. And by intelligently scaling back the visuals, it prevents it from looking ugly. And I think when people describe a game as being ugly, they're referring to artifacting, as it's known. So these are where image quality problems really pop up. So I don't know how familiar people are with things like aliasing, but this is essentially where an edge isn't properly smoothed out in a game, and this is more apparent at lower resolutions. Without putting a proper anti-alias solution in place, you can have games with lots of surface crawl and jagged edges, which can be quite distracting, and so it's important to dial back the graphics another way so that you can smooth the overall presentation out in a certain way. I feel like I've become a bit distracted from my original point here, but let's just look at the graphics of the Switch, seeing as we're talking about that right now. So this is another thing that certainly made me hesitate about the Switch overall. I am a massive fan of good graphics. If I wasn't, I wouldn't have spent so much money on a new graphics card recently just to get the best visuals I could. And so I am exactly the kind of person that wouldn't tolerate the Switch's graphical output, and yet I'm actually quite satisfied with it. Yet again, it's partially because of the Nintendo's ability to intelligently compromise and develop for the custom hardware, but also it's because Nintendo first-party titles, they have a very distinct look, which is almost has this anti-aging capability, and I made a separate video about this because it's quite important to think about. If you make a game that attempts to be fully realistic, you are giving yourself an inherent objective that you cannot reach. It's impossible to make something look truly realistic, right? So as good as Battlefield 1 looks now, in a few years time, maybe decade even, because it does look very good, it will look ugly because it tried to be realistic and it failed because you can't make something look like real life in a game yet. But if you make something more abstract, something more cartoony, then the developer defines their limitations. They define what a game should look like. What should Mario look like? You know, if you choose Mario to be a simplistic look, then you achieve that look, and you don't see compromise, you just see the image as the designer intended. And that's why simplistic target visuals can make for something that is as I say, timeless. So Mario Odyssey, for example, you can look at it and you'll see that the environments, for the most part, maybe not so much New Donk City, are very abstract, they're very cartoony. And as a result, despite some of the compromises in terms of fidelity, it will look good regardless. I also made this point for a few PlayStation games, actually. I made the point for Ratchet and Clank and Crash Bandicoot, the Insane Trilogy. These are games that are some of the best looking titles on the system because they achieve what they set out to do perfectly. Because they set, again, their own limitations and they make it perfectly. But because Nintendo do that so frequently, they are able to use the limited hardware to achieve something that does look nice and will continue to look nice for many years to come. Okay, so these are some of the praises I have for the Switch. It's got fantastic games at the moment, and of course Mario Odyssey to come, which I'm going to bet will be at the very least good, if not amazing. And it uses its limited hardware very well. Now let's talk about what is fundamentally its selling point, the hybrid nature of the Nintendo Switch. And this is why I can recommend a Switch to someone who already owns a PlayStation or an Xbox One or a PC. So the reason, in some respects, that the Xbox One and the PlayStation fans will always continue to argue is that at the base of it, they are very much the same device. Yes, there are some distinct qualities between the two, but when you really take a step back and look at the two devices, are they not incredibly similar? They are both standard home consoles that deliver very impressive visuals. They're essentially all-rounders, you know, they're the perfect balance between price and power. And they both offer very similar experiences, and you can play a lot of the same games on them, right? Like, I know people, including myself, like to point out that the PlayStation 4 base model is a little bit better than the Xbox One base model, and that the Xbox One X will be a little bit better than the PlayStation 4 Pro, but let's be real about it. They are very comparable in terms of power. You're getting a very similar thing. Okay, so to summarise the point I'm making here, fundamentally, when you look at it holistically, the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One are so similar that it doesn't make a lot of sense to get both, right? You make a decision and you stick with it. People like me who love to play all the games might get both, but we'll say for the average consumer it doesn't make a lot of sense. But the Switch offers something that neither of those do, and that is the hybrid experience. This isn't entirely unique to the Switch, but without a shadow of a doubt, the Switch offers it better than any other device I've ever used in my entire life. So, as you know, you can play games on the go, or you can play them in docked mode, so it's like a home console or a handheld. And what got me about this, because I didn't believe it when I saw the advertising, is how seamless it does this. There's no setup, there's no complexity. There's no setup beyond plugging your dock in, right? Other than that, it is so easy to do. So when I use my Switch in portable mode, it's typically on the train, right? I get an easy 45 minutes, not much to do, so I might play my game on the train. So I'll be playing it, I might be playing Zelda, and I'm about to encounter a boss, and then the train stops, I get off, and I'm like, okay, I'm done. If I was using something like a Vita, I'd then have to continue at home still looking at that small screen. But with the Switch, I take it out of my bag, I detach the JoyCons, I plug it into the dock, boom, you're done. It instantly transfers to your monitor or TV, and then you start playing it. It's crazy seamless. It's within seconds that it does the Switch. It's incredibly seamless. I still am very impressed when I do it. Or the opposite, when you're playing a game on the TV or the monitor and you realize, oh wait, I'm late for something, I've got to go, so you just pull the Switch out and it's on the small screen. You know, when you see it, you will be impressed. And when you look at a Switch game in TV or monitored mode, yes, it can look a little bit blurry, but when you look at it in portable mode, when you look at it in your hands, some of these games are shockingly good looking. I mean, Breath of the Wild in your hands using its lighting effects, it's absolutely incredible. The funny thing is about a lot of handhelds throughout the ages that have tried to be like simulating the home console experience. I'll use the PlayStation Vita and PSP as an example, is that for whatever reason they didn't 100% mimic the control scheme. So if you look at the PlayStation Portable, the PSP, it only had a single analog stick. So there were loads of PlayStation 2 games that just didn't really work on the PSP because it didn't have the second analog stick. And then they brought out the PlayStation Vita, and it was much better because they added the second control stick, but they forgot to add L2 and R2, right? These are very important buttons for most shooters, so you had to use the touchpad instead, which is massively inferior. But with the Switch, if you're just using the JoyCons, then you have exactly the same control experience between both, so there's no adjustment there. You are using exactly the same thing. However, I will say that the JoyCons are quite small, so they can feel a bit cramped, and for that reason I have chosen to buy a Switch Pro controller, which is really nice, by the way. But in the time I was using the JoyCons attached to that little plastic mount, it was perfectly good. You know, I played Zelda all the way through, and it was very enjoyable. And also, just talking about the JoyCons, something that you see as a bit of a hangover from some of their previous devices is the motion control. And they still make a selling point of this. I never used this at all. I think I used it for a few moments on ARMS, but I never really used the motion controls. I'll be quite upfront about this. I consider motion controls to be a total and utter gimmick. I didn't like the Wii for this reason, and I still don't. I just can't do it for any long amount of time. I remember when I was playing ARMS with the motion controls, I thought at first, oh, this is kind of cool, I'm boxing with my actual hands. And then after 10 minutes, I was like, oh, this is getting awkward. I think I just snap them back together and use buttons. Yeah, this is a million times easier, and I started doing better. Motion controls, in my humble opinion, are not the best way to play a game, at least in long periods, you know, for long gaming sessions. So, to summarise what we were talking about here, the portable mode is absolutely a selling point, and it's a reason that you can get it alongside another console, because it's not like this Switch is directly competing with the PlayStation 4 or Xbox One. It's doing something on its own, which is even more intelligent when you think about it, when you consider the PC's role in the gaming market. It's fair to say, in some respects, that why would you get a console when you can get a PC and have it far more powerful? Okay, there's a lot of turbulence around that question because, of course, consoles are far more cost-effective, and, okay, there's a billion arguments there, but whatever. But what you can say for certain is that the Switch offers something that your PC won't give you. You can't take your PC on the go. You can take laptops on the go, but, yeah, can't really do that handheld. You can't move about with that. You very much have to have that on your lap or on a table. And also what I found is that to get a decent gaming laptop, you have to spend a lot of money. I tried to get a gaming laptop a few months ago, and I spent so much money on it, and it's just, the results were very underwhelming. I mean, I spent a lot for not enough. And that's going to draw me back to another advantage of the Switch. It is cheap when you think about it. I got my Switch for, I think it was £280, maybe. About £280. And in the grand scheme of things, in a world where iPhones now cost over £1,000, or where consoles seem to be costing £400, I'm afraid I don't really know what they cost in the US, but I'm sure, relatively speaking, it's a similar difference. The Switch is a very cheap device, and a lot has to be said for value for money. And that's something that whenever I look at my Switch and what it can do and what it offers me, I think, wow, I can't believe how little I spent on that. Although the flip side is that on the Nintendo eShop, the games seem quite expensive. I think I spent £50 on ARMS, which is crazy. That game should have been like £20. But other than the expensive eShop, the actual console is, I think, very reasonably valued. Although, this brings me on to something that I wanted to talk about with regards to the build quality of the Switch. For its price, it is very good. In fact, I'd say the build quality exceeds what you'd expect for a console of this price point. But you know what I'd really like, and this is a bit of a wish list thing, it's just fanciful thinking. I would like Nintendo to offer a version of the Switch, call it the Switch Pro or whatever, that is a little bit more powerful, shall we say, and also more premium feel. So it's built out of metal, uses a glass screen, and has maybe metal controllers. I think now we're all a bit used to these high-end feeling smartphones like from Apple and Android. So the Switch, although it certainly matches its price point in terms of how it feels, it can feel a bit cheap and plasticky in the hands anyway. It's not something that needs to happen, and the fact it feels the way it does not detract from any of its experiences, especially if you're playing it in docked mode quite a lot. But hey, if there was a Switch Pro on the horizon, I'd be the first person to try and get one. So I've spoken about why I think you should go for the Switch, why it's worth getting even if you already own a PC or a PlayStation, and why the games for it I think are so fantastic. Now, because I can't resist nostalgia, I really love reminiscing. I'm going to talk about my history of Nintendo and how I've got to this point right now. So my first exposure to Nintendo was with the Game Boy Color, and I think it was a really young birthday present I got, and it was some really odd game. I think it was the Tweenies or something, but we quickly realised that we'd been sold an out-of-date product. Hey, you know, we were young, we weren't aware of the market as a whole. We realised that the Game Boy Advance was a thing, and so then we went out and immediately replaced it with a Game Boy Advance, and I was hooked on this tiny little device. It was so fun. I remember really enjoying the likes of Super Mario World, I believe it was. Also, what was it? It was Pokemon Leaf Green. Absolutely fantastic game. Had me hooked. And then I later upgraded yet again after I dropped my Game Boy Advance onto a rock. I upgraded to a Game Boy Advance SP. And I got this Pokemon themed one that looked really great. It was red with the picture of the Ruby Pokemon on the front. And again, I really loved it. And the great thing about this one was that it had a backlight. The thing about the Game Boy Advance was, and this is something we totally take for granted now with all our handheld devices, is that it didn't have a backlight. So if you were in the night or in a dark room, you couldn't see the screen. It required a light to be shone on it before you could see it. And the fact that the Game Boy Advance SP had this was a really nice advantage. And then we got a GameCube. We'd owned the PlayStation 2 and we were very happy with it, but I actually found myself gravitating towards the GameCube. I think I noticed even at the time the graphics were just a little bit better on certain games like Sonic Heroes. And I really loved some of the exclusive titles like Sonic Battle. I was a big Sonic fan back in the day, by the way. Still enjoy some of the games, but I loved Sonic back then. Also, Pokemon Colosseum, which was a console Pokemon game. And the absolute crowning jewel, and kind of why I'm so hyped for Odyssey, was Super Mario Sunshine, my all-time favourite Mario game. It was so colourful, it was so fun, it felt so refined. It was a beautiful experience, really, in every respect. And then Nintendo announced the Wii. The Wii used motion controls, as I'm sure everyone's aware, and this turned out to be the right decision for the company because the Wii sold like hotcakes, and Wii Sports is one of the most successful games of all time as a result. But it didn't really speak to me. It wasn't really the in-depth experiences that I'd come to expect from Nintendo from the GameCube. You know, I think eventually got some fantastic titles that I did enjoy, including Smash Bros. Brawl, Zelda Twilight Princess, and Mario Galaxy, which was fantastic. But I think at the time I was a little disappointed that it was still using standard definition when the world was moving on to high definition. So I didn't really get into the Wii, and the Wii U I skipped entirely. It just didn't appeal to me in any respect. I think it was actually an early review that put me off it, where I initially thought that because the Wii U was coming out after the 360 and the PS3, it would become the new most powerful console, but it turned out that because it was using such a unique IBM-based architecture that no developers could just really write for it. So although the first-party games were alright, things like Batman Arkham City didn't run very well, they stuttered, and I thought, well, that was the only reason I wanted one. I don't care about the gamepad, so I'm going to skip it. So it just wasn't for me. I'm sure loads of people loved it, but I skipped the Wii U entirely. I got very close to getting one at Christmas once, but then, for whatever reason, I decided not to. But with the Switch, I saw some early footage of Zelda and I thought it looked very impressive, and I decided to get it, and I haven't regretted it since. And when I started doing some more recent reviews, I made quite a few Switch reviews simply because I enjoy the console so much. I think it still deserves more attention than it currently has. So this was targeted mainly at people who don't own a Switch, but if you do own a Switch and want to share your thoughts, that would be very interesting to hear. I'm also trying to adhere to a longer format. I got some good feedback on my Shadow of War review that I really appreciated, by the way, and this is what I'd like to do going forward. However, there are two drawbacks to longer videos. Number one, they're not scripted, so I will sound more rambly, and secondly, I will pay little to no attention to what footage I'm putting in. Those are the drawbacks, but if you like this, let me know, because in some ways I do like to let feedback shape my channel. Because it's so small, I still need to know what people like. As always, people, thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.